the key issues that we're discussing?
Well, the conference is an annual affair. It brings together trade unions, employers, and governments, the world of work, if you like, from all over the world, sometimes called the Parliament of Labour, the Global Parliament of Labour. So it's really there to talk about the current issues. This year, we have discussions on global supply chains and the importance of decent work in global supply chains. We've got discussions about fragility and crisis and how to build jobs and peace and resilience. We have a discussion on globalization, on social justice for fair globalization. The ILO has now an 8-year-old declaration on this, which we're reviewing and making sure it's working well. The Director General has made the theme of his report, which will be debated in some depth next week, the End to Poverty Initiative, his centenary initiative. He sees this very much as the way in which the ILO is going to respond to the challenge of helping the UN and member states to implement the Sustainable Development Agenda. Alongside that, we have a number of other regular discussions on trade union rights, on labour standards in general. So it's a major affair. We expect every year there's between 4,000 to 5,000 people come here. This year maybe even more.
Excellent. You mentioned about the Director General, and today's opening statement, he spoke about the responsibility of the ILO. Can you talk a little bit about what he really means that the ILO is responsible for these Sustainable Development Goals?
Well, we share the responsibility, of course, with member states and with the UN system as a whole. But the Sustainable Development Goals, there are 17 of those goals, really embed the ILO's decent work agenda right across those 17 goals. And in particular, number 8 is on decent work and inclusive growth. So we're very pleased that the role of the ILO has been very much recognized in the conference, in the United Nations General Assembly decision to adopt these goals. But it's no good just congratulating ourselves that this recognition has taken place. We now have a responsibility to make sure it's going to happen. And 2030 may seem a long way off, but these are ambitious goals. They're really important ones. If you imagine what the world might be like in 2030 if they're not achieved, it's going to be a pretty miserable place. And we've got to get started. 15 years is going to seem a very short period of time when we look at the scale of ambition.
Excellent. You mentioned the Director General's report, and I'd like to just show this to our audience today. As you'll see, the list of goals are outlined here, and it's in the handwriting of our Director General, and he has given a number of sort of points to this. So we see decent work at the center of all of this. Can you speak a little bit about, what does actually decent work mean? How can we achieve it? And, what are the consequences if we don't?
Well, I think the main thing to realize is that there are very large numbers of people, approximately 30% of the working age population of emerging and developing countries are living and working pretty hard and not escaping from poverty. So decent work really is not just about the quantity of jobs, but it's also about the quality of jobs. It's about being able to enjoy your rights, enjoy your core labour standards of freedom of association, freedom from child labour, freedom from forced labour, and freedom from discrimination. It's important also that we have dialogue between trade unions and employers, because that's the best way to find your way forward on generating jobs and making sure that we have the social protection systems that underpin you if you can't work.
Excellent. To the viewing audience today, we are coming to you live from Geneva at the International Labour Conference here at the Palais des Nations. This is the 105th session of the conference, and we have a number of very key issues. My guest today is Mr. Stephen Pursey, the Director of Multilateral Development Cooperation. Stephen, you spoke again about this, the decent work, the importance of that, and as I've showed a little while ago, the cover of the Director General's report on the End of Poverty Initiative. That's a rather lofty goal. And we've got 17 goals, 169 targets, 268 indicators on this. How does the End of Poverty Initiative contribute to those goals?
Well, the End of Poverty Initiative is one of 7 initiatives that the Director General has launched towards our centenary in 2019. And it's interesting that the ILO has really been pledged from its beginning and from its relaunch after the Second World War to ending poverty. And now that the Sustainable Development Goals are there, this is an end that is in sight. It's an end that is defined in absolute terms. We've been traditionally looking at $1 a day or $2 a day for moderate poverty. Those have been changed a little bit as a result of changing prices. But the main thing is that the possibility of ending extreme poverty is there. We have the means and the resources. We also have a world that's growing more unequal. So side by side with ending absolute poverty, it's really important for us to narrow the social inequalities that are putting at risk the sustainability of development. Likewise, it's interesting, you referred to the Goal 8 on decent work and inclusive growth. Amongst the targets in that, we have full employment, but side by side with that, we have ending the connection between economic growth and environmental degradation. Because the Sustainable Development Goals are economic, social, and environmental. We have to have an integrated approach. For the ILO, that's a very familiar phrase. We've worked very hard to try and make sure that the responsibility for realizing the goal of decent work is seen to be one for the UN as a whole, even if we like to think of ourselves as the leaders.
I want to talk a little bit about the integration of these goals. I think that's really quite interesting. I think people can understand that if you say that you have a good job, then you can have better education outcomes. You can have better health outcomes. You can reduce poverty. But there are a number of other areas here. We're talking about quality education, gender equality. Can you speak a little bit about how decent work contributes towards those goals?
Sure. Well, let's think of one of the goals under health. We clearly need to make major progress in reducing the damage to health that is caused by epidemics, that is caused by viruses. So we need to build a healthcare system. And we have a number of goals as to what that would mean. We also have a couple of goals about how you implement it. And number 3C is that you need a workforce. You need a workforce that is skilled and trained and committed to achieving these health goals. In fact, if you look at the world as a whole and at the size of the health economy, it's one of the areas of potential growth of decent jobs. Now that's important for the goal of decent jobs. The interconnection, if you like, between 3 and 8 is there. But if we're going to make sure that we have a committed workforce, one that is really able to deliver, we've got to do things about the length of working hours, possibly the likelihood of poor pay, occupational safety and health problems around the workplace in the health sector. If we're really going to meet those goals, we've got to have quality jobs. We've got to have decent work in that sector, as well as increasing the number of people who are employed there.
Now, this is not something the ILO can do on its own, nor can the UN system. Goal 17, as some of our audience members will have noticed already, is that it's on establishing partnerships. The ILO, in many ways, is a partnership in and of itself. So can you speak a little bit about the ILO's tripartite nature and how that can actually influence the sort of wider partnerships we need to create to deliver on these goals?
Sure. Well, viewers may not realize it, but the ILO is the only global UN body where countries, states are represented not just by the government, but also by a representative of the employers and a representative of the workers. This is what we mean by tripartite. It's the dialogue between those three components, if you like, of the world of work that produces what we call social partnership. This is a long-standing concept at the ILO, one which is held very dearly. But again, if we're looking to see how decent work can contribute to sustainable development, number one, we have to have lots of employers, including very small employers, because the smaller employers are the ones who actually employ the largest numbers when you add them all up. But you also have to have good working relations between employers and workers, and that's the task that is set up by the ILO since its very origins, to make sure that trade unions representing workers can have orderly negotiations and collective agreements with employers, good consultations with government in order to establish a framework of laws that can govern the workplace. This is really what we see as social partnership, and that's going to be really important because decent work is a driver of the Sustainable Development Goals as a whole. It's an end. It's there as a goal, but it's also a means. Without generating more and better jobs, we're not going to have the resources to invest in education and health and all the other aspects of improving the environment. So the partnership, if you like, between the employers, the trade unions, alongside government, could be a key one in this global partnership that the UN is calling for.
For those who are just joining us here on Facebook Live, this is the International Labour Conference being held starting on the 30th of May here in 2016 at the Palais des Nations. My guest is Mr. Stephen Pursey, the Director of Multilateral's Cooperation Department. Stephen, I'd like to just sort of drill down a little bit into some of the things that are happening here. You've mentioned partnerships, you've mentioned social dialogue. But I think people are still skeptical. I mean, how are we going to be able to create these jobs? I mean, are you confident in the way things are changing in the world of work today, the relationship between the employers and the employees? Can you speak about some of the strategies that we need to implement and some of the tough decisions that have to be made as we move forward?
Yeah, sure. The 2030 Agenda sees the main means of implementation as being national sustainable development strategies. So the first thing the ILO is going to be doing is to be working with governments, with our constituents and the employers and trade unions, and also with the members of the UN teams in order to help governments put together that sustainable strategy for their own countries. I have to say, when you look at the global economic situation in 2016, we're not off to a very good start. The global economy is slowing. The recovery since the crisis has been pretty anemic. Global unemployment has crept up steadily during this period, with a big jump just after the crisis and no real fall afterwards. Employment participation in the world of work has slipped in many countries. So, we estimate that there are something like 60 million jobs fewer today than there would have been had we continued with the pre-crisis growth. So, this is really putting a bit of a hold on progress in reducing extreme poverty.
Excellent. We're getting some questions in from our viewers, and I'd like to read some of them out. And I have a question in from Joshua. And Joshua is asking, from the ILO's standpoint, what makes the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, different from the MDGs, which were the Millennium Development Goals? Can you speak a bit to that?
Sure. Well, there are several ways in which they're different. Firstly, the MDGs were really much more social. The SDGs are economic, social, and environmental. It's a much broader agenda. The participation by governments in the process, in developing the goals, was very extensive. Really, it started almost 3 years ago now, building up a lot of consultations around the world and discussions with civil society, gradually honing down towards to this ambitious list. A second part that I would really emphasize is that they're universal. The MDGs were a little bit, if you like, part of a north-south world. The SDGs are really universal. In other words, it's the wealthier countries are expected to have the national sustainable development strategies that we talk about and to do their part. This, of course, is going to be particularly important when we look at reduction in greenhouse gases and controlling climate change, where the bulk of the emissions are still coming from the industrialized world.
If we're going to be able to measure accurately what progress we made, we have to have baselines. But also, as you mentioned, this has to be delivered at the national level. So how are we expecting governments around the world to have the capacity to be able to measure how we're moving forward?
Well, there's several ways this is taking place. Firstly, there's been a big drive through the United Nations Statistical Commission to build up some consensus about a core set of indicators which all countries would aspire to use. Some are going to be more relevant than others because different circumstances differ, and countries will certainly have the flexibility to develop frameworks of indicators which are appropriate to their place. But the United Nations system, ILO included, is going to be there to support this process. I think one of the trickiest parts of the indicators discussion is that we're trying to capture quality as well as quantity. That's a real challenge for the world of the statistical world. Indeed, when we think about growth, we tend to think about this magic acronym GDP, Gross Domestic Product. That's really quite a narrow description of, if you like, people's well-being. And some of the things that the SDGs are aiming at go well beyond things that are captured by GDP.
For those who are just joining us, this is Kevin Cassidy, the Communications Officer from the ILO office in New York, here with my guest, Mr. Stephen Pursey, who is the Director of the Multilaterals Cooperation Department. We are at the 105th session of the International Labor Conference here in Geneva at the Palais des Nations. We were talking about the MDGs, we're talking about the SDGs. We're getting questions in from our viewers out there, and they want to know, when you say a better job, when you say a decent job, what is it specifically that constitutes a decent job?
Well, I think it's when we coined the phrase, which is now some 16 years ago, we adopted this word decent work in order to try and make sure that we're talking about more than a minimum. It's okay, but could do better. So it's acceptable, but we can strive for more. And now, we also use the phrase work because we want to make sure that we embrace people who are working in the informal economy, people who may not really know who their employer is because of the indirect relationships, so that it really is a global concept. Amongst the elements of, if you like, decency that we're looking towards are certainly wages, certainly working conditions, hours of work, certainly the availability of social protection. Those are, if you like, the more tangible elements of decent work. The more intangible elements, but very, very important, are things like the right to be able to join a trade union, the freedom from discrimination, the importance of being able to aspire to equality of opportunity in the workplace, freedom from forced labor, freedom from child labor, and the possibility to engage in discussion with your employers. In a sense, it's the old phrase, and you talked about this being the 105th conference of the ILO. The phrase back at the beginning was the dignity of labor. Decent work, if you like, is a 21st century way of expressing the same idea, the dignity of labor. We didn't want to have something that was statistically measurable in that sense. We capture it with a series of indicators, a dashboard, if you like.
I wanted to go back to the conference because it's rather amazing. I mean, many people may know and hear about the United Nations General Assembly, but they're less informed about the conference here. Can you talk a bit about the volume of people who are coming here and what their aspirations are and some of the special activities that are taking place over the next 2 weeks?
Okay, well, we just got started this morning, and the first piece of business is to form up a series of committees. So the thousands of delegates here will split up and go into a week of committee work in which there'll be detailed discussions looking towards conclusions. In some cases, these conclusions will head towards ILO standards. These are in the form of conventions and recommendations. Conventions are an international treaty which countries are invited to ratify. And when they ratify, they take it into their law, but they also promise to take it into their practice. So this is a rather strong way of building up an international corpus of labor law. The conventions are quite short. They're stated in terms of principles. They're not detailed laws because they have to be adapted to each country's circumstance. But that's really the legislative function, if you like, of this global parliament of labor. And one of the standing committees of the conference is the Committee on the Application of those standards, where countries are invited to discuss reports on the extent to which they are applying the principles in the conventions that they've ratified.
I believe there's a summit next week. Can you speak a little bit about that summit?
Sure. We dedicate one day of the conference to a leaders' discussion. This year it'll be on youth employment. We try to make sure that we have ministers. There'll be two presidents coming to that discussion, the leaders of the trade unions and employers. 2 weeks is a long time for world leaders to stay in Geneva. It might have been easy in the days of steamships, but it's no longer possible. So we really try to focus one day for leaders during that final week of plenary sessions, when the DG's report on ending poverty will also be discussed.
Now, you mentioned that the theme is on youth employment. Why is youth employment important?
Well, I think to the audience that might be listening to this, it's pretty evident why youth employment is important. The harsh reality is that when the global economy slows, the first thing that happens is that employers stop hiring. Then maybe they start firing. Either which way, you have a queue of young people looking for their starting job in a career. And it's just building up. We have much higher levels of youth unemployment around the world than in adult population. In some countries, we have not only youth unemployment, which is clearly measurable, we have another group of people who've dropped out completely, not in education or employment or training, NEETs. Finally, we have, particularly in developing countries, in the least developed countries, a very large number of young people can only find a job in the informal economy, often living in poverty, unable to really make a break into a career which can satisfy their aspirations and also enable them to build a family.
For those just joining us, I am Kevin Cassidy from the ILO's office at the United Nations in New York. My guest today is Mr. Stephen Pursey. He is the director of the Multilaterals Cooperation Department. Stephen, I'd like to just talk a little bit about some of our viewers' concerns. I have a question that's come in from Ali, and Ali says that how can governments and trade unions ensure that working conditions are in the favor of good business, but also a good form of remuneration?
Well, this is the function of the social dialogue process, because employers have an interest, a very strong interest, in improving the performance of their workplace. It's very hard to produce good quality products and services if you don't have a good quality working relations. And that's really the ethos which drives the ILO forward. The discussions here are between employers who are looking to provide good conditions with trade unions who are helping to improve productivity. So the combination of rising productivity, improving working conditions, in essence, it's what's driving growth. Governments are extremely concerned about that as well. The big question, of course, is how do you put all this mix together? Part of it is from laws, but the individual workplaces are essentially governed by the employers and the workers in the workplaces. So you have to have the social dialogue that goes all the way from this international conference in Geneva right through to workplaces around the world. We have a number of very interesting programs. I think the listeners might well be interested in the Better Work program. This is a program that focuses particularly on the garment sector. It's been operational now for nearly 20 years. And the interesting thing is that the companies are anxious to join this program because the buyers, the big brand name buyers of garments, like to know that working conditions are improving. That year by year, quarter by quarter, things are moving forwards, maybe from a very low baseline, because the garment industry is usually the first rung on the ladder of industrialization. But this program is really proved to be very successful. It's a joint program financed with the World Bank and a number of governments, and increasingly companies themselves are buying into it.
For those who are just joining us, this is Kevin Cassidy from the ILO office in New York. My guest today is Mr. Stephen Pursey, the director of the Multilaterals Cooperation Department. Stephen, before we were talking, you mentioned about the Director General's report, the End to Poverty Initiative. And I noticed that in the corner here of the 17 goals, it's written Future of Work. Now, that's a really fascinating concept, and I think our viewers would be very interested. What is the concept of the future of work, and what do you see it as?
Well, the Director General is looking ahead to the second century of the ILO, which would be launched in 2019 at our conference here that year. And looking ahead, what is going to be the future of work? And perhaps most importantly for the ILO and for the Director General is how can we shape the future of work so it's a future that we want? This connects particularly with the End of Poverty Initiative because, as I mentioned earlier, some 30% of the workforce in emerging and developing countries are working long and hard and not escaping extreme poverty. There's another substantial group of working women and men who are just above that poverty threshold and always at risk of slipping back, either because of some personal disaster in their life or because the economy slows or there's an earthquake or other major crisis situation. So vulnerability to poverty is something that we really want to try and escape. So looking to the future of work over the period to 2030 and beyond, how are we going to make sure that we improve the working conditions for that segment of the workforce? There's a lot of discussion about robots and about technology, very important. But let's remember that maybe half of the world's workforce are struggling on the margins of poverty, trying to escape, and we really need to make sure that the future of their work is one that is going to enable us to achieve sustainable development.
Our guests who are watching on Facebook Live, I encourage you in the comments section to send us the comments and to join this conversation with us. We have a question in from Tanya, and Tanya wants to know, how is the ILO working with academic institutions to promote the concept of decent work?
Well, it's very interesting. We have a research department which has very close contacts with academics around the world. There's a lot of research going on into how you connect the quality and the quantity of employment. Very shortly, I'll be leaving to hear Professor Ian Begg. He's been invited by the committee that is examining the Social Justice for a Fair Globalization Declaration to give us an overview from the point of view of a very renowned professor. So yes, we have a good connections with academia. It's really, if you like, really important for us to quality check our work. We need a critical audience who looks at the way we're doing our numbers, the way that we're doing our analysis, to make sure it really stands up solidly. And the connections with the academic community are really important in that regard.
Excellent. So we're here live with you today on the 30th of May here in Geneva at the Palais des Nations. I would like to turn our attention back to the sort of outcomes of the conference. I think many people will see that, the UN has many conferences around the world, getting people together to discuss these issues. And although important, I think people wonder, what actually is the benefit of this? What are the one or two tangible kind of outcomes of this conference? And if you can drill down a little bit to say why those outcomes are important.
Well, I think the way in which the discussions here are picked up and used by the delegates when they return home is really important and interesting. I mean, if we're looking at the supply chains discussion, the really important thing is what happens in workplaces in the supply chain, and the messages going from here are very clearly that it's not good enough to get onto the bottom rung of the ladder and just stay there. You really got to be able to move up. First of all, you may slip off the bottom rung if you don't look to progress as a country and as a business and as a workforce. So going back, it will arm, I think, those people around the world who are keen to make sure that supply chains do generate decent work for its own sake, decent work as a contributor to the sustainable development process, decent work as an important part of keeping the world economy open and, let's say, peaceful. That's a second discussion that we're having on jobs, peace and resilience. One of the first things that one sees in countries that are fragile is that there's serious problems of decent work. There are huge decent work deficits. You can't make a direct correlation between unemployment or underemployment and social conflict. But there's a lot of evidence to show that indices of social conflict do tend to rise alongside weakness in the labour market. So again, countries which want to escape that situation really have to focus on generating decent jobs, especially for young people, so that again, looking at the increasing number of countries where fragility is apparent, we've really got to make sure that we can make a contribution there, and delegates will be going back. I think one of the issues, of course, that is on a lot of people's minds is migration, and in particular the problems of refugees who are fleeing from states of danger. The sad fact is that most refugees are out of their country for 17 years. That's the average that the UN has recently published. You can't just stay living in charitable donations in refugee camps for 17 years. You've got to find some way to earn a living, to make a break, and to build a life. Maybe a life that will eventually go back to be back in your own country. But the step from, if you like, getting to safety and then trying to rebuild is really important, and one that, again, will be a big focus of the discussions here.
Turning from environment now to issues such as health and education, we have a question in from Antha Siri and asking us to sort of shed light on the importance of health and education in the SDGs in the aspect of achieving a quality labor base. Why is it important to have a healthy workforce and a well-educated workforce?
Well, from a narrow economic point of view, because a healthy and a well-educated workforce is much more productive. Productivity is also what drives the generation of investment resources, which can then be recycled back into more jobs and into improved education and health facilities. So if we can get onto a virtuous circle, the connection between decent jobs, improving education, improving health is really like a central concept for sustainability. I would say that, of course, the reverse applies too, is that dangerous workplaces are firstly very costly, costly to the community, costly to the employer, and costly, of course, first of all, to the workers concerned. So making sure that we improve safety in workplaces is really important. That, again, will be a big part of the discussion on supply chains. We've had a number of really horrible disasters where workers have lost their lives in conditions which really were quite intolerable, but which had contributed to the production of goods that goes onto the global market. And consumers don't want to buy things that are at that sort of risk. So again, really important for global trade that working conditions and particularly safety conditions in workplaces are seen to be improving all the time. That's a core responsibility of the ILO and the ILO's constituents.
For those who have just joined us on Facebook Live, this is Kevin Cassidy from the ILO office in New York. My guest today is Mr. Stephen Pursey. He is the Director of Multilaterals Cooperation Development. This is the first or the premiere of a series of discussions that we'll have over the next 2 weeks, and we're going to be finalizing our discussion here. I'm going to start with a question from Vishal. Vishal has asked us, can we talk a little bit about the ILO's work on refugees, their safety in the refugee camps, and where does the ILO come into that discussion?
Well, we try not to get in the way of the people who are involved in the initial safety of refugees or displaced people or people who are suffering from the impact of natural disasters. It's not our job to making sure that the medical facilities and the tents are there. But very soon after that, the question arises, how are the refugees going to sustain themselves? How are they going to work? And unfortunately, in many cases, they end up in the informal economy. So that we have tensions building up between workers in the host country and perhaps workers who are working in the informal economy. We even have situations of child labor developing. So it's really important to, at a very early stage in the planning of refugee situations, to build a strategy. Now, of course, that's a lot easier said than done. Number one is many of the refugees end up in places which are rather poor communities, where the local population don't have adequate, decent work opportunities. So an example of what we're trying to do is in southeast Turkey. The Director General visited the camps in that region just last week. There, the effort is to, first of all, work with employers to find out where the job opportunities are. Secondly, to offer training programs that enable refugees to match themselves with that skills, including language training, in this case mainly for Syrian refugees learning Turkish. Provide opportunities even in the camps, teachers, they're running schools. So once you start really digging at the problem, there are solutions to be found. They're not easy, but you have to get at them, recognize that they're there, and really start to deal with them. But there's a lot of news, of course, about the Syrian refugee crisis. But this is the sort of thing the ILO has been doing around the world, in Kenya, in Nepal, in many situations, Philippines, where fragility, crisis in one form or another has displaced people from their homes and also from their workplaces. Rebuilding their life is also partly about rebuilding their working situation.
We're going to be coming to a close very shortly with this session today. There are 2 weeks of sessions, so please tune in to us and send in your questions. We have some wonderful guests that are coming up. My guest today is Mr. Stephen Pursey, who is the Director of Multilaterals Cooperation Department. Stephen, I just want to have 2 more questions for you, and I think the most important thing for me is that we work at the ILO. We know what our benefits are in terms of what we can bring to the table. How are we interacting with the UN, and what's the best way forward in terms of using our skill sets to complement what the UN system provides?
Well, I think when one looks at the UN, and the thousands of really qualified and committed people who are working, many of which are very specialized skills. When we look at the idea of an integrated decent work agenda, an integrated sustainable development agenda, the trick that we're going to have to pull off is to try to make sure that all those different specialisms, all that high quality expertise comes together in a package at the service of the member states. Now, I don't think we've been so good at that in the past, but I don't see any reason why we shouldn't be much better at it in the future. I think one of the elements is training programs. I think we have to learn about each other. We have to learn about how to operate as teams, the skills of operating as teams. I think there's a tremendous opportunity there for the contribution of the ILO to be understood by others, but it's a two-way street. We also need to understand how our work can relate to colleagues who are dealing with the environment, colleagues who are dealing with sustainability of oceans, colleagues who are dealing with the sustainability of cities, for example. So, yeah, I'm very excited about this. I think this is a really tremendous opportunity for the UN, 70 years after its foundation, to really reconnect with to use the phrase from the Charter, we the peoples.
My final question to you is back to this original concept of decent work. As you mentioned, it's a concept we've been, or a reality that we've been focused on for many years. On the one end, you have people who are working and being paid fairly. They have good conditions of work. There's good remuneration. They can move between jobs. And many people who don't have the opportunity at the far end of the spectrum. And we see the sort of the modern slavery. We see the forced labor. We see the conditions of human trafficking. The ILO is launching an alliance of 8.7. How can that be instructive to people about if we tackle the worst forms, that we can actually promote that race to the top? Are you confident that by focusing on those kind of ideas that we can push the ILO's expertise into the fore?
Sure. For people who may not be familiar, 8.7 is one of the goals of SDG 8. It's focused on forced labor and child labor. These are issues which the ILO has been concerned with from the very, very beginning. But again, you need a movement here. It's not good enough just to pass a piece of legislation. Many countries, nearly all countries in the world, have legislation seeking to abolish and get rid of child and forced labor. But it continues to exist behind the curtain, under the table. To really get at it, you have to have a movement. And that involves employers, involves government, involves social movements. It involves some money. Not as much money as one might think, because forced labor is not very productive labor. You know, again, I get back to the point is that if you want people to be productive at work, you've got to pay them decently, you've got to offer them decent conditions. Forced labor is a recipe for sliding backwards, not moving forwards. Same with child labor. If children are not at school, they're not learning the skills that they're going to need for the future of work that we were just discussing a moment ago. So yeah, I think there's going to be a tremendous response to the idea of rallying around Goal 8.7 as something that is. It's really outrageous that we're still having to fight this fight in the 21st century, and the sooner we win it, the better.
Is there a final thought that you would like to leave with our viewers out there today?